In this video, we are going to consider the authorship of the Gospel of John. Throughout church history, many took it for granted that John, the son of Zebedee, penned the fourth Gospel. That claim, however, has been hotly contested by biblical scholars today. For example, many maintain that the Gospel was written anonymously by someone with no personal connection with any of the events that happened in the Gospel. Others contend that it was written by an anonymous representative of a certain community in Ephesus. Some scholars argue that the beloved disciple was actually another John, known as the Elder John. Now, no matter anyone's position, there are many that contend that the gospel underwent multiple redactions or additions. In fact, over 20 such alternative theories have been proposed, yet none of them seem to have achieved any consensus. Now, as you can imagine, despite the fact that most contemporary scholars reject the traditional position, I'm going to make the case in this video that the traditional authorship of John makes the most sense. Now, as I've done in the previous videos, we're going to first consider the external evidence and then the internal evidence. The external evidence refers to the statements made by the early church, while the internal evidence refers to the evidence from within the gospel text itself. And we will start with the external evidence. Now, for the sake of brevity, I'm only going to consider the church citations that date up through the end of the 2nd century or so. Now, there are a lot more I could add, but I just want to save more time for the internal evidence at the end. Now, the first known writer to credit the gospel to the Apostle John is Irenaeus, around the year 180. After listing the authors of the first 3 Gospels, Irenaeus asserts that John, the disciple of the Lord, who also had leaned upon his breast, did himself publish a gospel during his residence at Ephesus in Asia. As is well known, Irenaeus was a disciple of Polycarp, who was a disciple of John. So with only one intermediary between him and John, Irenaeus' claims here cannot be easily dismissed. Now, notice 2 things about Irenaeus' quote. First, notice how he claims that John wrote while he was living in Ephesus. And this is where church tradition has John for the final decades of his life. But secondly, notice how Irenaeus makes clear that John is the one who leaned upon the Lord's breast. And this is a clear reference to John chapter 13, the upper room scene where Jesus predicts who is about to betray him. Now, beginning in verse 23, it reads, "Now there was leaning on Jesus' bosom one of his disciples, whom Jesus loved. Simon Peter therefore beckoned to him that he should ask who it should be of whom he spake. He then, lying on Jesus' breast, saith unto him, Lord, who is it?" Now, I quoted here from the King James Bible because the language it uses is much closer to Irenaeus. So you can see that Irenaeus is connecting this disciple with whom Jesus loved, or simply the beloved disciple, with John. And not only is this unnamed beloved disciple John, he also claims that he is the author of the text. Now, Irenaeus gives no indication that the authorship of John or the identity of the beloved disciple was disputed during his time. He doesn't try to defend this position, he merely assumes it as fact. It seems likely then that the tradition predates Irenaeus by a good bit. And this is especially evident given the many other references to Johannine authorship from some of Irenaeus' contemporaries. For instance, Polycrates, a bishop in Ephesus during the time of Irenaeus, also claims John, who was both a witness and a teacher, who reclined upon the bosom of the Lord, and being a priest wore the sacerdotal plate, sleeps at Ephesus. Now, Polycrates' reference to John's priesthood has drawn much attention, and it will be considered later. Nevertheless, having lived in Ephesus for over 65 years, as he tells us elsewhere, Polycrates is in a strategic position to know who was the author. He's also in a strategic position to know John's burial location in Ephesus as well, and also that he is the beloved disciple who reclined upon the bosom of the Lord. Several other contemporary sources also affirm traditional authorship. Here's Theophilus of Antioch around the same time as Irenaeus. He says, "And hence the holy writings teach us, and all the Spirit-bearing, inspired men, one of whom, John, says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God," showing that at first God was alone, and with the Word in him. Now, in this passage, Theophilus quotes from John 1:1, a text he calls holy writing, and he attributes it to John, whom he calls a spirit-bearing man. Another reference we find is in the Muratorian canon, also around the year 180. It reports, "The fourth of the Gospels is of John, one of the disciples." Now, this Muratorian canon is the earliest New Testament canonical list that we have, and it seems to have come from Rome. Also writing about the same time as Irenaeus is Clement of Alexandria. He states, "But, last of all, John, perceiving that the external facts had been made plain in the gospel, being urged by his friends and inspired by the Spirit, composed a spiritual gospel." This quote is especially interesting in that Clement claims that John was the last disciple to publish a gospel and that he was inspired to write a, quote, spiritual gospel. Now, there has been much dispute about what Clement meant by spiritual gospel, but it's evident that he sees that John's gospel is of a different sort than the other three. And finally, shortly after Clement, a quote by Tertullian that I've shared in previous videos on the authorship of the other Gospels. He says, "Of the apostles, therefore, John and Matthew first instill faith into us, whilst of apostolic men, Luke and Mark renew it afterwards." Here, Tertullian claims that it's the apostle John who wrote a gospel. So what we find then is universal consensus in the first couple of centuries that someone named John wrote the fourth gospel. Now that said, though the early church unanimously affirms that someone named John wrote this gospel, there are some scholars who contend that it was a different John than the Apostle John. They say it was a certain elder John, a person who's referenced in Papias's writings. Consider the following quote from Papias around the year 125. He says, "If then anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I questioned him in regard to the words of the elders, what Andrew or what Peter said, or what was said by Philip, or by Thomas, or by James, or by John, or by Matthew, or by any other of the disciples of the Lord, and what things Aristion and the elder John, the disciples of the Lord, say." Certain scholars, such as Martin Hengel, think that Papias distinguishes between two different Johns here. The first John, the son of Zebedee, is part of the first group of 7 apostles, while the second John belongs to a secondary group of disciples. And he claims that it was the second John, the elder John, who penned the gospel. Hengel contends that the verbal tense form for the verb said, what's called the aorist tense in Greek, used for the first group of 7, suggests that they belonged to and spoke in a previous era, while the present tense verb for the verb form saying, used for the final 2 disciples, suggests that they were contemporaries of Papias and still speaking in his day. Richard Bauckham also agrees that Papias knew 2 Johns and that it was the elder John who penned the gospel. Bauckham further argues that both Polycrates and Irenaeus believed that there were 2 Johns as well. He notes that since Polycrates claims that John wore the high priestly garb, he could not have been referring to John the son of Zebedee, since there's no evidence that he ever served as a priest. And with respect to Irenaeus, Bauckham just argues that Irenaeus never makes clear that the John he's talking about is the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee. Now, just by way of response, the Elder John hypothesis suffers from a few significant weaknesses. First, it's not abundantly clear that Papias referred to two separate Johns here. In the apostolic era, it does appear that apostles were occasionally called elders. For instance, Peter writes to the elders as a fellow elder in 1 Peter 5, verse 1. Similarly, John introduces himself as the elder in both 2nd and 3rd John. Papias is most likely alluding to this language when he calls the 7 apostles elders. Now, to avoid this conclusion, Bauckham is required to insert ellipses into Papias's text. Consider the ellipses in the bracketed sections of Papias's quotes. If, then, anyone came who had been a follower of the elders, I questioned him in regard to the words of the elders. That is, what? According to the elders, Andrew, or what Peter said, and so on. Now, Baukham's ellipses here change the meaning of the text so as to keep Papias from labeling the apostles as elders. Yet these modifications are unwarranted, and they change the meaning of the text. Now, if we eliminate Baukham's insertions, it's easy to see that Papias uses the term elders to describe the disciples of Jesus. If, then, Papias refers to the apostles as elders, there's no reason to think that the elder John is not just simply the apostle John. So why then does he list him twice? It appears that Papias likely utilized a literary feature known as the article of previous reference with the elder John to signify that he was identifying him with the previously mentioned John. This is a feature in Greek where the author first uses a noun without an article, and then he repeats that noun later on with the article. The article in this case is ha, that short underlined word that looks like a lowercase o. It is John's way to say that he's referring back to the previously mentioned John. This article of previous reference is Papias' way of saying, the John I already mentioned. Also, while I disagree with Hengel's conclusions that Papias has two Johns in mind here, I agree with understanding the different tense forms used in this passage. Papias uses the aorist tense, said, to refer to the group of elders/disciples who spoke in the past. And then he shifts to the present tense for saying, because these elders/disciples were still alive and speaking in Papias' day. In other words, John appears to have been the only one from that original list of elders/disciples who was still alive and speaking in Papias' day, alongside an otherwise unknown disciple named Aristion. Now, another weakness to the elder John hypothesis is that even if it is true that Papias is referring to two different Johns here, which I think is unlikely, it does not follow that second John wrote the fourth gospel. Papias nor anyone ever makes that connection for us. It's quite a leap, then, to identify this second so-called elder John with the beloved disciple and author of the fourth gospel. A third problem with the argument is that Bauckham likely interprets Polycrates' language too literally, the priestly language in particular. Polycrates probably intended for his priestly language to be taken figuratively in a similar way that other New Testament writers do. Consider 1 Peter 2, verse 5. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For Peter, all Christians are part of the spiritual priesthood. Polycrates is probably referring to this reality, not that John was literally a high priest in the temple. And it should just also be noted that there's no other evidence to support the idea that a well-known Christian named John ever served as high priest in the Jerusalem temple. Now, a fourth problem with the Elder John view is that there isn't any evidence to suggest that Irenaeus had different Johns in mind. In his writing, Irenaeus never distinguishes between John the disciple, the apostle, and the author of the fourth gospel. For instance, Irenaeus writes of those who were conversant in Asia with John, the disciple of the Lord. Some of them, moreover, saw not only John, but the other apostles also, and heard the very same account from them. Irenaeus indisputably links John, the disciple of the Lord, with the apostle John in this passage. There isn't any hint in Irenaeus that he knew of two different Johns, and for this reason, I think we should just utterly reject the elder John theory. So in summary, the early church unanimously affirmed that the apostle John, one of the 12, was the author of the fourth gospel. No competing tradition exists. Now, what about the internal evidence? Does it corroborate with the external evidence that the apostle John was the author of the fourth gospel? Well, as was true with the previous three gospels, the Gospel of John is formally anonymous in that he never identifies himself by name in the body of the text. Nevertheless, John does come close to doing this in John chapter 21, verse 24, where he writes, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things, and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true." Now, we'll consider this text a bit more in a few moments. For now, I want us to consider the most important piece of internal evidence for gospel authorship: the titles on the earliest manuscripts. If there was a competing tradition of gospel authorship in the early church, it most certainly would be reflected in the earliest manuscripts, especially on the titles. But notice what we find in all the earliest manuscripts for the fourth gospel. John is always listed as the author. They are titled either Gospel According to John or simply According to John. There are no exceptions. With respect to the unanimity of the titles, Martin Hengel offers this charge. Let those who deny the great age and therefore basically the originality of the gospel superscriptions, in order to preserve their good critical conscience, give a better explanation of the completely unanimous and relatively early attestation of these titles, their origin, and the names of authors associated with them. So, the external evidence from the early church and the titles on all the earliest manuscripts confirm traditional authorship. But do we have even more evidence than this? Any more internal evidence that might support this traditional view? Well, I think we do. Now, the first place to consider are the 7 passages where this anonymous beloved disciple appears in the text. The first implicit appearance comes in John 1, 35 to 40. Here we read that John was standing with 2 of his disciples. Now, just notice real quick that he is not called John the Baptist, but just John. The other 3 Gospels all identify him as the Baptist, but not in this Gospel. It will be important to remember that later on. Now, we read here that when the Baptist declared that Jesus was the Lamb of God, both disciples left to follow Jesus. Verse 40 reports that one of the disciples was Andrew. The other disciple remains anonymous, but it's most likely the beloved disciple. Now, the first explicit mention of this beloved disciple takes place in John 13, 21 to 25, as Jesus reclined with his disciples for the Last Supper. Verse 23 reads, "One of the disciples, whom Jesus loved, was reclining at table at Jesus' side." As we saw earlier, classic works often translated this Greek phrase as "in the bosom or breast of Jesus." The next implicit reference is found in John 18, 15 to 16, when Simon Peter and another disciple entered into the courtyard of the high priest because the other disciple was known to the high priest. After gaining access, the text reports that Peter denied Jesus. The next appearance comes at the crucifixion scene in John 19, 26 to 27, where Jesus sees his mother and the beloved disciple standing by the cross. While they stood there, Jesus entrusted his mother to the beloved disciple. The text goes on to report that this disciple witnessed the soldiers pierce Jesus' side. Next, in John 20, verses 2 to 4, Mary Magdalene reported the news of the empty tomb to Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loves. Both Peter and the beloved disciple ran for the tomb together, but the beloved disciple outran him. I can't help but think John was just bragging a little bit here. Now next, after the resurrection, John 21, 1-7 reports that 7 disciples were fishing on the Sea of Tiberias. Among the 7 were the 2 sons of Zebedee, though their first names are not mentioned. After the miraculous catch of fish, we read that the beloved disciple is the first one to recognize Jesus. Once the disciples hauled in their miraculous catch of fish and came to shore, the beloved disciple makes one final appearance in John 21, verses 20 to 25. After Jesus' back-and-forth dialogue with Peter about feeding sheep, verse 20 notes, Peter turned and saw the disciple whom Jesus loved following them, the one who had also leaned back against him during supper. After a brief discussion about the duration of the beloved disciple's life and the subsequent false rumors that he would never die, verse 24 attributes authorship to him when it states, "This is the disciple who is bearing witness about these things and who has written these things, and we know that his testimony is true." After slipping into the first-person plural verb, verse 25 then shifts back to the first-person singular to conclude the book. And it says, "Now there are also many other things that Jesus did, were every one of them written, I suppose that the world itself would not contain the books that would be written." This shift between the first-person plural and singular has led many scholars to conclude that John underwent multiple editions. In fact, many contend that John originally ended at John 20, verse 31, with his purpose statement, "These are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name." Now, this does seem like a fitting conclusion to the book. And so many suggest that John originally ended here, and that the epilogue in chapter 21 was added later by others. Ben Witherington, he argues that the use of the first-person plural we is a dead giveaway that someone or someones, other than the beloved disciple, put this gospel into its final form. Thus, for Witherington, the beloved disciple's testimony, it did play a significant role in the gospel's development, but he was not responsible for its finished product. Yet, verse 24 unequivocally states that the beloved disciple is the one who wrote these things. The Greek word gropsos requires that the beloved disciple either wrote the gospel himself or, at minimum, he dictated it to a scribe. I should also like to point out that those who maintain that this book was produced in multiple stages by multiple authors cannot account for the overall unified nature of John's gospel. Responding to those who argue for multiple redaction layers, Richard Bauckham demonstrates that John was a unified whole from the beginning, which did not originally end at chapter 20, verse 31. He argues that the epilogue was not a secondary appendage, but an intentional feature that the evangelist utilized to balance the prologue at the beginning of his book. Now, even more fascinating is how Bauckham observes John's sophisticated literary devices throughout this book, specifically using numbers and numerical data. So, for example, Bauckham observes that the prologue contains 496 syllables, while the epilogue contains 496 words. This numerical consistency is hardly accidental and demonstrates that there was intentional balance between the two texts. 496 is also the numerical value for the word monogenes. That's the Greek word most often translated as only begotten, that appears prominently in John 1:14, 1:18, and of course, John 3:16. That these numbers are not coincidental is further evidenced by the other numerically significant features in John. For instance, Jesus' prayer in John 17, 1b through 26, contains 486 words. That just happens to be the numerical value of the Greek word pater, the word that's translated as father, which is both the opening word to the prayer, the object of the prayer, and it's a word that is used 6 times throughout the prayer. The section in chapter 119 through 211, which features the many Christological titles such as the Christ, the Son of God, the Lamb of God, the King of Israel, consists of 1,550 syllables, which just happens to be the numerical/gematria value for ha Christos, the Greek word for Christ. To further defend against the proposition that John originally ended at 20, verse 31, Bauckham observes that both summary statements in chapter 20, verses 30 to 31, and the summary statement at the end of the book, chapter 21, verses 24 to 25, consist of 43 words each. Thus, John does not have 2 separate endings, but a 2-stage ending which frames the epilogue. These numerical features reveal a level of coherence which makes it highly improbable that John was put together piecemeal by multiple redactors over time. How, then, is the unity of the text consistent with the use of the plural in chapter 21, verse 24? Again, Bauckham argues persuasively that the we in chapter 21, verse 24 is a literary device that a single author would use to intensify his authority, a feature sometimes called the plural of majesty, where writers were known to occasionally switch back between the first person singular and the plural for emphasis, while still only referring to themselves. Consider the following quote from this ancient Greek historian Dionysius. He says, "I would have given you examples of what I have said, but for the risk of becoming a bore, especially it is you that I am addressing. That is all we have to say about the style of Demosthenes, my dear Emmaus. If God preserve us, we shall present you in a subsequent treatise with an even longer and more remarkable account than this of his genius in the treatment of subject matter." Here, Dionysius transitions from first person singular to plural without changing the referent. He clearly intends for the first person plural we to simply stand in for I. Well, in the same way, John utilizes this literary device throughout his writings to enhance his authority or to make a solemn declaration. This appears to be what he does here at the end of his book. These passages reveal then that the primary witness and author of the gospel is the beloved disciple. But is there any reason to believe that the beloved disciple is, in fact, the Apostle John? Well, I think that there is. And to reach this conclusion, we're going to follow a 5-step argument that was first proposed by B.F. Westcott over 100 years ago. This 5-step argument makes a concentrically inward-moving argument that the author was, number 1, a Jew, 2, from Palestine, 3, an eyewitness, 4, an apostle, and number 5, he's John. So, number 1, that the evangelist was a Jew is hardly disputed. He knows of Jewish messianic expectations, the finer points of Jewish law, Jewish festivals and festival traditions, the Jewish hostility towards Samaritans, their various cleansing rituals, their burial customs, their adoration of the Jerusalem temple, and he just knows the Old Testament very, very well. Number 2, the evangelist was also from Palestine. The first clue is that he occasionally includes Aramaic phrases, a language not used throughout the Roman Empire. The author also shows special knowledge of Palestinian geography that foreigners would unlikely know. For instance, he knows of small villages and towns such as Enon, Salim, Bethany, Bethsaida, Cana, Capernaum, Ephraim, and Sychar. Moreover, he's aware of topographical features such as that travelers went up to an elevated Jerusalem. Even more impressive is his knowledge that travelers went down from Cana to Capernaum. Additionally, John knows small landmarks such as Jacob's Well in Sychar, the stone pavement in Jerusalem, the Sheep Gate, and the small pools of Bethesda and Siloam, both of which have been excavated by archaeologists. The third step in Westcott's argument is that the evangelist was an eyewitness, something that the author claims for himself. In chapter 1, verse 14, he writes, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory." Furthermore, in chapter 19, verse 35, it says, "The beloved disciple who saw it has borne witness. His testimony is true, and we know that he is telling the truth." Elsewhere in 15:27, he clarifies what eyewitness testimony means. Here Jesus says, "You also will bear witness because you have been with me from the beginning." So in short, the evangelist views himself as a participant in the events described from the beginning and is therefore the authoritative witness. Finally, if the unnamed disciple in 135 through 40 is the beloved disciple that was with Andrew there and had originally followed John the Baptist, he would be the first and last disciple mentioned in the book. Just like we saw with Peter in the Gospel of Mark, this literary inclusio would be yet another indicator that the beloved disciple is the primary witness in this gospel. Fourth, the beloved disciple is an apostle, one of the 12. His presence at the Last Supper supports this conclusion. As the synoptics make clear, this meal was shared between Jesus and the apostles alone. This scene, as well as the crucifixion where Jesus entrusts his mother to the beloved disciple, would seem to exclude the possibility that this figure is the otherwise unknown Elder John. Westcott's fifth step and final step concludes that the beloved disciple is John. If the beloved disciple is otherwise anonymous in the gospel, he cannot be any of the other named apostles, which would be Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathanael, Thomas, Judas, son of James, or Judas Iscariot. The post-resurrection fishing scene provides even more clarification when it reports that in addition to Peter, Thomas, and Nathanael, 4 other disciples were present, one of which was the beloved disciple. Of the 4 remaining, in chapter 21, verse 2, we're told that 2 sons of Zebedee were there, as well as 2 others. The inclusion of the sons of Zebedee is striking since the author has avoided using their names up to this point. Yet they still remain individually unnamed. Now the author could not be James the son of Zebedee since he was martyred in the early 40s, as is recorded in Acts chapter 12. Therefore, the beloved disciple is either John the son of Zebedee or one of the other 2 unnamed disciples. Other internal evidence tips the scales in favor of Johannine authorship. Throughout the gospel, the beloved disciple is portrayed as a close companion of Peter. In the same way, the synoptics, Acts, and Paul all indicate that Peter and John were close associates. Moreover, the beloved disciple appears to have been a fisherman, a close companion of Andrew, and one of the earliest disciples. These features are consistent with the synoptic gospels, which claim that John and Andrew were fishing partners and that they both became early followers of Jesus together. Additionally, there is a strange omission of the Apostle John's name in this book, even though lesser significant disciples are named. This omission would be unthinkable if it came from someone other than the Apostle John. If, however, the immediate audience knew that John was the author, well then, this omission would be more understandable. It would also explain why he calls John the Baptist John, without the qualifying title, the Baptist. Any other author would need to distinguish the 2 Johns. One is John the Baptist, the other is John the son of Zebedee and brother of James. This is how all the other New Testament authors distinguish them. However, John the Baptist is simply John in this gospel, because the Apostle John's original audience knew that he was the author, and so he did not need to provide that distinguishing title, the Baptist, for the other John. He is simply just the other John. That said, traditional authorship is not without its objections. Critics contend that if John the son of Zebedee wrote the 4th gospel, he never would have left out all of the synoptic stories from Matthew, Mark, and Luke in which he was intimately involved, something like the Transfiguration. This objection, however, loses its force when one realizes that John did not simply intend to repeat the accounts from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. He most likely knew those Gospels, but he wished to provide a complementary account and to fill in the gaps, so to speak. Others argue that an uneducated Galilean fisherman could never have written a Greek Gospel. For support, they appeal to Acts 4, verse 13, which calls Peter and John uneducated men. Yet, this objection overlooks a few significant details. First, Acts 4:13 does not mean that John was illiterate. It only means that he was not rabbinically trained. Second, John probably came from a wealthy family, since his father owned a large fishing business with hired workers. We see this in Mark 1, verse 20. John's social status, then, makes it likely that he would have received a good education. Third, archaeological findings demonstrate that the Greek language had been used widely in Galilee, alongside Aramaic, since the time of Alexander the Great. Since John worked in the business world, he most likely conducted business with Greek speakers regularly, especially given the large Greek-speaking Galilean cities of Tiberias and Sepphoris nearby. It's also worth noting that John would have had decades in Greek-speaking Ephesus to improve his Greek before writing his gospel, and that he could have used a Greek scribe to help him in his writing. In the end, none of the objections outweigh the positive internal evidence that John the son of Zebedee penned the fourth gospel. So in summary, the internal evidence corroborates the external evidence that the Apostle John wrote the fourth gospel. The manuscripts all list John as their author. Moreover, the beloved disciple claims to be the author of the book, and the gospel itself reveals that the beloved disciple is the Apostle John. Thanks so much for watching. Be sure to hit like and subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments below.